Two quick things before we get started on this review. First, by my opinion, this review is completely spoiler-free, but then again, I don't consider it a spoiler if it happens in the game's opening, and some of the stuff that Angry Joe seems to consider spoiler material, I don't, so to proceed at your own caution. And second, Arkham Knight is a very long game, and I did not collect footage as I was playing because I just wanted to enjoy the game casually without any worries. So a lot of the footage you'll see is just me casually playing the game and may not have any relevance to what I'm actually talking about. I wanted to try and get this review out while the game was still relevant, and hell, this at least prevents you from having to look at my face the whole review, right? The game picks up 9 months after Arkham City. The Joker is dead, and the statute of limitations on that spoiler has officially expired, and Gotham is mostly peaceful. Up until the Scarecrow stages a chemical attack with his newest toxin, threatens to gas the entire city, and causes all of Gotham's citizens to evacuate, so there's nobody left but criminals and cops. Shortly after the Scarecrow's takeover, an army of mercenaries comes to Gotham, led by the mysterious Arkham Knight, who has a personal vendetta against Batman, and has specifically trained himself and his men to counter Batman's tactics. Facing down an entire army, Scarecrow trying to destroy the city, and an enemy who knows his tactics and moves, it's up to Batman to save Gotham one last time. And I do mean one last time. This is literally the first line of dialogue in the game.
This is how it happened. This is how the Batman died.
See, Batman is being poisoned by the Joker blood that he got in Arkham City, slowly transforming physically and mentally into a new Joker. There's no cure in sight, so Batman is grappling with his mortality, the fear of what he'll become when the Joker takes over, and the guilt of having brought so many allies into his fight on crime, whom he's basically destined to abandon, betray, or worse at this point. Batman's internal struggle leads to a lot of dramatic weight in the story, and it definitely leads to the high parts of the story. One of the things that I really enjoyed about the game is Batman's fear of what the Joker blood is turning him into manifests as him hallucinating the Joker everywhere he goes once he's exposed to Scarecrow's toxin. He basically follows you around everywhere, trolling you endlessly. So I hope somebody picks up that phone, because I called it! Probably my favorite Joker moment in the game is you walk outside after completing one of the buildings, you're cornered by militia, and the Joker walks out going, "You wait here, Bats, oh Joker will show them." You grapple out of the way, the militia opens fire, and the Joker just gets Robocopped. I was laughing so hard. Then you use the Batmobile's remote control to take out the goons with rubber bullets, and the Joker's like, "Personally, I would have used live rounds." By the way, I looked it up, and they got Mark Hamill to come back as the Joker again, despite him stating repeatedly that he was retiring the character after Arkham City. And for the record, he's also voiced the Joker in DC Universe Online expansions and in The Flash.
A day without casualties was like, well, like the Cubs winning the pennant. It just never happened.
What happened, Mark? You heard Troy Baker's performance impersonating you in Arkham Origins and weren't amused?
This is obviously the work of a rank amateur, at best, a mere pretender angling for my throne.
I'm going to talk about the gameplay before I circle around to my problems with the story. The combat is still excellent. They've added new enemy types and new enemy attacks, like goons will try to tackle you requiring a quick draw batarang, or put you in a full Nelson, and there are medics who can revive enemies and electrify enemies so you can't attack them. Most of the special enemies are vulnerable to specific quick draw gadgets, which aren't nearly as overpowered as they were in Arkham City, thus giving you more options and strategies to approach combat. The combat is largely the same as the previous game, don't fix what isn't broken. The only major innovation is the ability to take down enemies by chucking them into environmental hazards, like fuse boxes or the Batmobile's cannon. You can pick up enemy weapons too, which lets you punch through some enemies' defenses, but total honesty, I never did that. The only problem I have with the combat in Arkham Knight is that there's no visual and almost no audio cue when you take a hit, unless the hit came from a special enemy. This led to a few fights where I died or came close to dying from what felt like out of nowhere, because I didn't realize I was missing so many counters, what with how split-second the timing can be in combat. Also, 4 games into the series, they finally let you attack enemies that are lying on the ground, rather than constantly losing combos because you tried to attack someone who hadn't gotten back up yet. But what's been improved upon the most since the other games is the Predator encounters. Predator maps are significantly more complicated than they've been in any of the other Arkham games. They have multiple levels, and they usually lack the gargoyles that everyone abused in the previous installments. Plus, if you're fighting Arkham Knight goons, the enemies actually adapt to your tactics. Use the overhead vantage points, and they'll furiously grenade those vantage points. Use the grates, and they'll throw fire bombs into the grates. There's also drones that give away your position but can be hacked, sentry guns that force you to avoid areas or carefully take them out, and big bald guys with miniguns that take so long to bring down you're forced to save them for last. They've even found a way to reduce the usability of the detective vision. You can't see the vision range of sentries or drones in detective mode, and there are even enemies invisible to your detective vision. Plus they also add medics to the Predator sections too, so you have to be careful to take them out first or else enemies just keep coming back. Hold on. Enemies with sentry guns, bald brick shithouses with miniguns, medics, snipers, invisible enemies, and enemies that spam grenades and mines? Nah, that's just a coincidence. I'm honestly stunned. The levels and enemy AI force you to shake up your tactics regularly, plus the gadgets are nowhere near as overpowered as they were in Arkham City. If you have a gadget that helps you out in stealth, it's a gadget that needs to be used creatively, like the disruptor that now has to be very carefully aimed like a sniper rifle, or the voice modulator that lets you command enemies to move to certain locations. They help you without doing all the work for you, and it's a great balance. The only issue that I have with the Predator sections is a new mechanic called the multi-fear takedown. If the enemies aren't alerted to your presence, you can jump into a group of enemies and wipe out 3 to 5 of them in one move by taking them by surprise. You come across some enemies that are grouped together too closely, you press one button, and immediately wipe out, 25 to 30% of the enemies immediately? They try to balance it out by only letting you use it once before you need to recharge it with a silent takedown, but I still found myself abusing it frequently. So combat, good. Predator sections, good. The map is, I think I heard 5 times the size of Arkham City, and you have a souped up grapnel boost that makes exploration super fun, and there are plenty of objectives through the city, so wandering around the sandbox, good. But there's one major weak point to the gameplay, and that is, irony of ironies, the most heavily hyped portion of the game, the Batmobile. Outside of the odd puzzle and a tool for exploring the sandbox, the Batmobile is used for 2 things, car chases and drone battles. Just driving the Batmobile around the city feels fine and is pretty cool, but making sharp turns when you're chasing someone is an epic pain in the ass. I never got the hang of drifting, and every time you leave the ground and land again, the physics engine kind of has you stall and often swerve in another direction, which leads to the person you're chasing gaining a ton of ground on you. There are also Riddler racetracks and certain sections of the story where you have to drive the Batmobile up walls inside tunnels, and the controls lock up so badly when you're on a wall that you basically have to get the angle just right before you drive into the wall, or else you go off course and die. These frustrations make the boss fight with the Arkham Knight's drill machine infuriating. But as annoying as the car chases can be, at least you're not forced to do them every handful of minutes. If you hold the L2 button, the Batmobile enters battle mode, where you can freely aim and move in any direction and fire tank shells and rubber bullets. Use the battle mode to find tank drones. So many tank drones. There are tanks patrolling the streets. There are tanks defending the bombs you need to disarm for a side quest. There's a redeployment of tanks on the streets at some point in the story, and there's at least 2 dozen points in the story where you're forced to fight a horde of tanks, and every drone fight feels exactly the same. You basically have one weapon to fight the tanks with, a 60mm tank cannon on the Batmobile. You fire at a tank, wait for your cannon to reload, fire again, repeat until the entire group is dead while dodging the little white lines that show where enemies are going to shoot. Your only other weapons are a Gatling gun to intercept missiles and shoot helicopters, and special weapons that take a long time to charge and then can be used once. So you essentially have just one weapon, and there's only 3 basic enemy types in the entire game, because Rattlers, Twin Rattlers, and Diamondbacks all do the exact same thing. The tank fights get really monotonous, and there's a ton of them. You can't help but feel like the game is just shoving the Batmobile down your throat, forcing you to use it like we spent all this time developing you and you're gonna use it, motherfucker. Because there are so damn many of these drone fights. And the thing is, the Batmobile sections aren't awful, they're not even bad. The problem is that the Predator and Combat sections are both so many orders of magnitude better than the Batmobile fights that they feel crappy by comparison to the rest of the game. You groan whenever you're forced into another tank battle because it's game time being taken away from the better parts of the game, and it just feels like you're being forced through them. And quite frankly, the tank fights are so numerous and so monotonous that it feels like shameless filler. The game has a total of 14 side quests, though 2 of them boil down to go to one location and win, and the side quests have an excellent variety to them, and some of them are a lot of fun. My favorites are the Two-Face bank heists where the enemies can't hear you over the alarm, so you get to do the loudest takedowns you want before the enemies make off with too much money, and the Penguin side quest where you trail a vehicle by gliding out of view, which was really unique and a ton of fun. Less fun was the Riddler's puzzle rooms and races, which revolve around the Batmobile's wonky physics, and considering you're supposed to do the Riddler's challenges to rescue Catwoman, yeah, that quest sank to the bottom of my to-do list really quickly. What really surprised me about some of the side quests is that you're not told where most of them are. To track down Firefly, you have to search the skyline until you see smoke rising out of a building. To track down a serial killer, you have to explore until you hear opera music, and so on. There's always an internal logic to it. You're alerted where Two-Face is because he sets off the bank silent alarm, but you're not alerted to Man-Bat's location, so you need to search for him until you hear his cry. Though, as much as I admire the lack of hand-holding and expecting you to figure stuff out on your own, scouring the city looking for the last 3 Arkham Knight bombs is really starting to get on my nerves. But there are always 2 primary aspects to a modern video game, the gameplay and the story. From a gameplay standpoint, Arkham Knight is amazing. The combat, the stealth, the sandbox have all been honed to near perfection, and the Batmobile, while being a fun tool to explore with, drags the game down when you're forced to use it, but it's not bad. It just sticks out like a sore thumb from the rest of the finely tuned gameplay. But the big major weak spot of Arkham Knight, at least for me, is the story. The story is hands down the weakest aspect of the game, and definitely the biggest disappointment. You know how everybody loved the first 2 Arkham games because they ran you through a diverse gauntlet of Batman villains? Arkham Knight doesn't do that. There are exactly 3 villains that you fight in the main story. The Arkham Knight, Scarecrow, who basically just gives the Arkham Knight orders, and Harley Quinn, who shows up for a grand total of about 30 minutes, during which time she contributes jack shit to the plot. All the other villains, Two-Face, Riddler, Penguin, Firefly, they're all relegated to side quests and have nothing to do with the main story. See, the main story is actually that all the villains basically just pooled all their money so that Scarecrow could hire the Arkham Knight, and then the Arkham Knight used all that money to buy his army. So the villains don't have anything to do with the story, and this wouldn't be such a big problem if it weren't for one major issue. And I admit this is 100% my personal opinion. The Arkham Knight is not a compelling character. This guy has exactly 3 character traits and aspects. He really wants to kill Batman, he knows Batman's tactics, knowledge that he rarely actually uses, and his identity is a mystery. That's all we learn about him. Just wanting to kill Batman really badly is not enough to make him compelling, and just having a secret identity is not enough to make him interesting. I also figured out the Arkham Knight's identity a few hours into the game, which I'll talk about in a later video, so the one thing the guy has going for him is a mystery that most people are going to solve a few hours into the game. And as the story goes on, the Arkham Knight actually gets even less compelling. Every single line the Arkham Knight has is, "You're going down, Batman. You ain't shit, Batman. You're gonna die tonight, Batman. Blah, blah, blah." There are 4 points in the story where the Arkham Knight and Batman are face to face, and the Arkham Knight runs away without so much as throwing a punch. The only time he's ever willing to fight Batman head on is when he's in the biggest, most heavily armored vehicle that he can find. The guy's a pussy! As the game goes on, it just gets more and more difficult to take the Arkham Knight seriously. It sinks in that the only reason this guy is a threat to Batman is because he bought an army to fight Batman for him. Hell, at the end of the game, when you fight the Arkham Knight, he doesn't actually fight you. He just pulls out a sniper rifle and sits in a corner like he's hoping that you just walk into his bullets for him. This is the one villain that the entire story is built around, and he never actually fights you! Pussy! The story just feels like a mess. Not only are we stuck with the boring-ass Arkham Knight as our main villain, but the Scarecrow's master plan to bring down Batman once and for all is so convoluted and multi-staged that it feels like the Scarecrow pulled multiple parts of his plan straight out of his ass. The game starts with Scarecrow trying to build a bomb that will cover the entire eastern seaboard in fear gas. Okay, you foil that, then they kidnap one of Batman's allies, a plot twist they run into the ground, by the way, and you spend a large chunk chunk of the game playing The Princesses in Another Castle. Then Scarecrow pulls another Doomsday Machine out of his ass, and you spend another huge chunk of the game tracking that one down. You stop it, and that's still not the end of the game. There comes a point in the game where the Scarecrow has basically won. The entire city is flooded in fear gas, which is established to have no cure and no way to counter it since it seeps through clothing. You stop the attack, and then the city returns to completely normal, despite having, not mere seconds ago, being immersed in gas that is established to basically be instant death. And immediately afterward, the city and game just keep on going like nothing happened. Alfred even casually calls you up to ask if you want to do a few side quests. It's like, isn't 90% of the city supposed to be dead now? I'd argue that takes precedence over trying to shut down a few roadblocks. The Scarecrow goes through like 3 or 4 master plans by the time the game ends, and the story just feels disjointed because there's never one overall goal or story to the game other than just the generic stop Scarecrow. It doesn't help that there are several chunks of the story that are blatant filler, like the militia out of nowhere attacks GCPD and you spend quite a bit of time stopping them, and it has nothing to do with anything in the story other than we wanted a gap between the Arkham Knight boss fight and the final confrontation with Scarecrow. It's no secret that Paul Dini, one of the fathers of Batman the Animated Series and the guy who wrote the first 2 Arkham games, was fired by Rocksteady before they began scripting this game. I can't help but feel like Dini would have done a much better job with this story, making the Arkham Knight interesting, actually incorporating the other villains into the narrative, making the plot flow much better and trimming filler, and so on. It just feels like the guys who wrote this story were so in love with the idea of Batman fighting an actual military by himself that they just built the entire freaking game around it, and the game suffers for it. It feels less like an epic conclusion to the Arkham series when almost all of the major villains set out the main conflict. The militia are not interesting enemies. The Arkham Knight is not an interesting enemy. So instead of the entire story being interesting, there are chunks of the story that are compelling with dull slog in between them. And don't get me wrong, there are plenty of powerful moments in the story, usually when it moves to focus on Batman's inner conflict, and chunks where you want to press full steam ahead to see what the game does next. It's whenever the story lapses into destroy this thing the Arkham Knight owns that your interest in the story just drops. Also, I was paranoid about doing all the side quests that I could because you're flat out told that Batman dies at the end of the game. Yeah, don't do that. The game actually doesn't let you go to the end of the game until you've completed at least 11 of the side quests, and you don't get the full ending unless you do all 14. Kind of wrecks the pacing of the story when there's a few hours of busy work between the epic climactic showdown and the actual ending of the game. And one thing that really is just a personal pet peeve of mine, but it really shows their priorities in the game have shifted. There are no boss fights in this game. The only boss fight in the game is the aforementioned Pussy Sniper Arkham Knight battle, and all of the other bosses in the game are military vehicles that you fight in the Batmobile. I can't even begin to tell you how big a letdown this is after the epic and creative bosses in Arkham City and Arkham Origins. There isn't even a final boss fight. The entire ending of the game is essentially a cutscene. By the way, I'll touch upon this in the spoiler video too, but the ending of the game is just way too convenient for me. I loved the ending. The conclusion to the story is a massive mind trip, and it's probably the most imaginative scene in the entire series. I really want to talk about it, but I promise no spoilers, so I'll just stop here. Batman Arkham Knight is a great game, there's no question about it, but it's not perfect. The story leaves a lot to be desired, and the Batmobile's mechanics are noticeably and by far less polished than the rest of the game. As far as a conclusion to this amazing series, yeah, it could have been a lot better, but as a game, it's still loads of fun and has tons and tons of content. If you liked the other Arkham games, then yes, by all means run out and get it, just temper your expectations a little bit. It's a great game and I love it, but it's not the mind-blowing conclusion that you've been expecting. If you can cope with that, then you'll have a lot of fun with it too. Oh, and special thanks to Warner Brothers Games for farming out the PC port to a third party that had 8 employees working on it and stuck DRM that's known to screw up games into it. Thank you for justifying further my hatred of PC gaming, and you PC gaming master race people, have fun waiting months for your patched version to come out, if it ever does.